Hi everyone, greetings and welcome back for our February team training for teams who are in their second year of the PBIS Academy. I'm Christine Downs.
And I'm Eric Mackey.
And we're trainers for NEPBIS. And this presentation was developed with support of the NEPBIS network. So today's agenda will be to review implicit bias and neutralizing routines, which are routines that help us interrupt the biases that we are unconscious and we don't realize are happening. So we'll talk about that around vulnerable decision points in our school day. And we're also going to review Tier 1 getting started steps. And our tasks will be to identify those potential vulnerable decision points where implicit bias is more likely to come up and develop some of those neutralizing routines. And again, we'll assess our action plan at Tier 1 and make sure we have all those getting started steps in place. So take a moment to download some of these resources if you haven't already. The first here is a slide deck from a presentation done by the University of Oregon about neutralizing implicit bias in school discipline. And you can find the entire presentation on PBIS.org. The next reading there, Don't Discipline Hangry, is from the Teach by Design blog on PBIS apps. And it talks about strategies for addressing those vulnerable decision points when we respond to undesirable behavior in our students. The VDP worksheet, which we're going to use later in this video, is a document that you and your teams can use to develop these neutralizing routines for your school's vulnerable decision points. And the neutralizing routines mini module is a 13-minute-ish video that talks about, again, vulnerable decision points and neutralizing routines, sort of a little specific deep dive into that. And it might be helpful if you and your team need a refresher later on any topic. And that last link there is a link to all of the mini modules that have been created. Again, little deeper dives on isolated topics. And they are on the NEPBIS.org website under the Tier 1 School-Wide tab, and down at the bottom, PBIS Academy Virtual Learning. All right, so especially in our current political and social context and climate, talk about equity can really be hard and bring up some strong emotions, including with us as trainers. And whether you're in a live session with us or you're meeting with your team separately and viewing this video, it's really important to have some ground rules because discussions can really highlight systematic inequities in our educational systems with regard to race, gender, sexual orientation, physical ability, and that can bring up some personal feelings in individuals in your group. So again, we want to make sure it's a safe space to have discussions, and here are some norms that we're suggesting. First is to ask questions, right? If you need clarification, rather than making assumptions in your head, ask for a clarification. Speak your truth about your own experiences rather than speaking for someone else. Speak about how they've affected you. Make no assumptions, but good intentions by others, even if you disagree with what they're saying. Assume they have good intentions. And get comfortable with discomfort. It's when we push through our own discomfort that we really can begin to break down our biases, or at least address them and have honest conversations about change. So in our last team meeting, you were asked to complete the What is my own cultural learning history activity. Hopefully you got to watch the video of George Sugai discussing his cultural learning history and him explaining how it shaped how he views the world around him. If you didn't get to yet, take a moment, you can pause this video and view that video and complete the learning history activity. They can both be found on the January syllabus page, NEPBIS for year 2. And once you've completed the activity, have a discussion with your team about what you found out and how you learned about your own history and how it's affected you. Whoops. Here's a slide that I started. This is what it looks like when you download the activity slide. It's a little messy, but it does have all the same categories in here. And you can see I started to add in some of my own life events that led to my own personal identity, right? And how it shaped the world as I see it and interact with those around me. Just as one small piece of it, I did move around a lot growing up, and in several of the schools I moved to, I experienced bullying. I internalized a lot of that, and the nurse was always my best friend, and the person I knew first in any new school kind of made me realize how important a positive environment is for students, both externalizing and internalizing, and kind of led me to my career path. But as far as some of my biases, maybe, I think that I found that while I was working in alternative settings earlier in my career, I was definitely more reactive and judgmental of students when I perceived them as bullies or displaying bullying behavior. Even if their behavior was possibly more cultural, or maybe it was just assertive and they were defending their own needs. So I really had to learn to step back and examine the situation before I reacted and just made an assumption. Eric, do you have any examples?
Sure. So I'm an only child, and I grew up in a mostly white middle-class town. There were very few people of color where I grew up. It wasn't until I went to college, traveled around inside and outside the US, and started working in mental health that I really interacted with people with different backgrounds than me. I often found some styles of communication to be kind of jarring, and I would feel kind of like I would have kind of a physical reaction, especially when there would be multiple people speaking at one time, or people talking over kind of the main speaker, or conversations that were like super lively. I can still get kind of uncomfortable in those situations and put on my heels a little bit, and I find myself having to remind myself that this is just different. It's not bad. It's not wrong. It's just different.
Exactly. Thank you.
So with that said, let's connect how these biases emerge, how they can impact our decisions, especially around discipline, and how we can develop strategies to help reduce the impact of biases on our decision making. In our last team session in January, we introduced a 5-point intervention for enhancing equity in school discipline. We covered steps 1 through 4, including using an engaging instruction to reduce opportunity gaps, implementing school-wide PBIS, using data, and implementing policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. Now we're going to talk about step 5, which is teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. So let's look further at implicit bias and make sure that we're working from a clear definition. Implicit bias is something that we all experience as humans. They are unconscious, automatic thoughts that impact how we make decisions, especially when we're under pressure. These unconscious, automatic thoughts come from our life experiences and the stereotypes we incorporated throughout our lifetime. As hard as we work to be unbiased, the reality is that we all have stereotypes. In some ways, there are prototypes that help us to make sense of the world in a very quick and simple way. When we're given time to think about our stereotypes, very few of us would say that we agree with them or that we would want to endorse them. Yet they're there, and they show themselves at times when we can't think things through as much as we'd like when stressed, rushed, tired, or hungry. They can also show themselves when decisions are kind of unclear, such as when criteria for decision making may be kind of vague, or when you have to make a value judgment, such as when you have to decide what to do around disrespect or disruption. Those are both very broad categories, and you can go in a lot of directions with those. So let's spend a moment and hear about some research on bias and teachers.
There's a new study out of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing, a black boy, a black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. Well, here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and black alike, spent the most time watching the black boy, waiting for bad behavior that never came. There's one more really interesting headline in this study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. The researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a black child, or even a black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else that's true.
Thoughts, reactions? Likely, if you were to ask any of those teachers if they had any biases towards children of a different race, they'd likely say no, and they'd mean it. It's what lurks behind our conscious awareness that impacts how we behave in these scenarios. So we need to have conscious strategies to mitigate our biases. So it would be easy for us to say that racial bias is what leads to disproportionate discipline of students, right? But there's a problem with that model. Racial bias is hard to change, and it really doesn't consider the contextual variables that would influence our decision making. But if we adopt a model that considers context and how it interacts with implicit bias, then we have something we can work with. Consider this example. A teacher may make more equitable discipline decisions at the start of the day when fully refreshed from sleep and maybe a cup of coffee, but may be more likely to send certain students to the office at the end of the day. Unwittingly, through her exhaustion, she may be sending out more students of color and or students with disabilities than others. This brings us to talk about equitable decision points versus vulnerable decision points. As mentioned in the prior slide, we want to be able to identify the contexts and situations in which we are more likely to make an unequitable decision regarding discipline. Equitable and vulnerable decision points are identified using data. If the data suggests that no particular group is getting disciplined more often and more intensely than others, then your teachers and admin are being equitable in their decision points. If the data suggests that there are particular groups that are getting disciplined more frequently or more intensely than other groups, then you have vulnerable decision points. It's important to then break down those incidents to identify the elements of the situation, such as the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why of the situation, as well as much as possible, the individual's decision state. With such an analysis, we can develop strategies to address the vulnerable decision points, or what we'll often be calling VDPs. So let's talk about those decision states. Have you seen those Snicker commercials where people act incredibly agitated out of hunger to the point where they look and act like different people? They have different actors. Yeah. Then once they've eaten, they're themselves again. I think we can all kind of relate to that. When we're depleted, we're more likely to make impulsive decisions based on our internal biases. The research has indicated that being hungry, or at least maybe hangry, has an impact on decision making. For instance, there is research that suggests that for those seeking parole, their requests are more likely to be granted just after the judge has eaten. Also think about your wherewithal or willpower as the day draws longer. Might your decisions look different when you're starting to get tired? There's also research suggesting that our moral decision-making decreases as the day wears on. These are very human and real experiences. There's no one to blame and no need to blame. We just need to be honest with ourselves and think about when we're more likely to make those snap decisions. Looking at national data, the most frequent VDPs come from situations in which the problem behavior is subjective, such as when having to make a decision on broad categories like defiance, disrespect, disruption. They also tend to come from non-classroom areas, such as hallways, where there's a lot of commotion and potential for misunderstanding or not seeing the whole scenario. They also tend to come from classrooms where students and adults spend the most time. And they happen in the afternoon where fatigue and hunger may settle in. In a moment, we're going to give you some time to brainstorm about the times and situations that are most vulnerable for your school. So how can we reduce the effects of implicit bias? What can we control if those biases are always lurking, waiting for our weak moments? Well, we can reduce ambiguities in how we respond to behaviors by having clear definitions for our behaviors. Think about disrespect and how that can encompass a broad range and intensity of behaviors. How can we break that down into observable chunks with clear parameters as far as how we respond? We can also reduce the ambiguities by having clear guidelines as to who should manage which behaviors based on those severities. We can also reduce ambiguities by looking at the data and revising rules that result in disproportionate exclusion from class, such as maybe there's a dress code that impacts certain populations more so than others. Can that dress code be revised to be more equitable? We can also use data to identify vulnerable decision points at the school level, such as when and where do most of us struggle. We can also identify VDPs at the personal level. When do I struggle? And we can employ what we call neutralizing routines. And these are routines in which we take a moment to assess whether we're in one of those VDP moments. And if so, then we have a strategy, a predetermined response. As a quick aside, when it comes to disrespect, we should be very clear in our definition so that we don't discipline students for expressing their needs and their points of view. We just may need to teach students how to do that appropriately within a school context. So back to VDPs and neutralizing routines. Here's a nice example of a two-step VDP neutralizing routine. Step one, identify whether you're in a VDP. To identify whether you're in a VDP, you might want to consider what's going on around you and how you're feeling physically and emotionally in that moment. If you find yourself in a VDP, then it's time to use an alternative response. Well, what could that be? Let's talk about what that response could look like. So imagine you have a student with whom you have maybe a less than optimal relationship. You've tried your hardest, but something's just not clicking. And you're tired. It's towards the end of the day. The student starts complaining. This is kind of her pattern. She's complaining about the writing assignment that you've just assigned. This is what she does. And you have decided that this is disrespectful, or maybe it's disruptive, and you decide that you send her to the office. She goes, and the both of you escape each other for a little bit of time, which just perpetuates the cycle. Furthermore, she's not getting access to the curriculum. What could we do instead? Well, let's take a look at how we're feeling in that moment. We hear those loud complaints. How are we feeling as that's happening? Maybe our blood pressure is changing, or our face is turning red, or you're clenching your teeth, or you're clenching your fists. You're probably in a VDP moment, and it's important to recognize that. So instead, you recognize that you're in a VDP, and you take a deep breath, and you decide, okay, my response is going to be, I'm going to model what she's supposed to be doing in this situation. So you say, you know what, this is what we do in this situation. You raise your hand and you let me know, I don't understand this work. Can you help me? So that's how we can work through a VDP. Just an example. So what are some good elements to a neutralizing routine? First of all, you want to make sure that there's a clear if-then strategy, such as if I feel my face redden, then I need to take 3 breaths. You want to keep the strategy quick and feasible with clear steps, like reframing the situation to yourself, such as thinking, this child is learning, this child is learning. The ultimate goal is that your neutralizing routine should interrupt the chain of events and allow you some time, space, and wherewithal to think rationally about how you're going to respond to the student. Some other examples may be if you're feeling triggered or agitated, maybe you can delay your decision. You're kind of wound up, so maybe you can ask the student to see you after class or at the next break. That buys you a little bit of time to take those deep breaths and to think rationally. You can reframe the situation in front of the student and ask, is this how we do things at our school? Let's take a look at our school values. I think right now, this is the expectation. You can also make sure to take care of yourself. Make sure that you're rested, make sure that you're fed. And if you're tired and if you're not well fed by the time this incident happens, maybe it's time to take a walk, or maybe it's time to grab a snack or something. Take care of yourself so you can be thinking a little bit more rationally in that moment. So take a moment to pause this video, download the VDP worksheet and fill it out on your own. Identify what you think your VDPs might be and 1 to 2 neutralizing routines that could work for you. It may be helpful to identify your triggers and cues that you're in a VDP, like having a reddening face, maybe it's crossing your arms, clenching teeth, balling your fists, shaking, increased heart rate, shoulders tensing, and what you could do when you experience those signs. When you're back with your team, discuss the common VDPs for the adults at your school and how you might introduce the concept of VDPs and neutralizing routines to your peers.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so now that you're about halfway through this year and your any PBIS experience as a whole, let's take a moment to check in on your getting started steps. So by the winter of 2020 last year, you guys had just been introduced to all of the 10 getting started steps of school-wide PBIS. We had just gone through all of them. And we were focusing with you on building your teams and your school's knowledge of PBIS, sharing out with the rest of the staff. And you were working on staff buy-in, getting them to really buy into what you were doing in this change in these new skills. And really, hopefully, momentum was building around PBIS and people were starting to get a handle on it. And you were thinking about rolling it out or at least testing some out in the spring. And then boom, right? The pandemic hit. And we had to stop and take stock of what was feasible to do and what was too overwhelming. Right? So as we enter this latter half of this school year, it's a good time to review these 10 getting started steps again, so that you can check on the foundations of PBIS in preparation for what will hopefully be a more normal school year next year. So we're going to briefly go over those 10 steps. remind you of what they all are, and give you time to assess what's currently going on in your school, what is actually in place, what needs to be adjusted or tweaked or changed. So, and as we do this, have your action plan there and update your action plan as needed. Even if some of the things you're going to work on may come later. You want to get them all written down. All right. So first, right? First, it's always about our team and what our team stands for, our statement of purpose. Your team should have membership that's representative of your entire school community. Administration is really important to have on your team, as are teachers, paraeducators, special areas teachers, people from all over your school community, as well as parents, community members, and students as well. And really, from at any age is appropriate to have student input of some sort. You want your team meetings to be efficient and effective. So you should meet at least monthly, if not more frequently, if possible. When you do meet, you should have an agenda that organizes your meeting. Someone should be taking minutes, so you have a record of that meeting, and an action plan. And we use that to organize our tasks that have to get done from that meeting. To ensure buy-in and sustainability, the school community should identify student behaviors as one of the top priorities for your school. Often this looks like building improvement plans. There's something around school climate, culture, discipline, things like that. And hopefully there's also resources allocated to your team and this important item, right? Including time at PDs, staff meetings, time to build the skills in your staff and their knowledge around PBIS. And once your team is formed, hopefully it created, and you might want to go back and reread it, but a statement of purpose. What is the purpose of this team? What is the desired outcome that you're looking for through this team? Might be improved school climate, maybe a safe and supportive environment, to have strong attendance or equitable discipline in your school, something along those lines. Gives purpose to your team when people say, what are you guys all about? So if you think your team needs to focus on any of these tasks, first off, jot a note on your action plan and come back to those topics when you have time. And there are a few links here that you can go for more information on these topics. I encourage you to check those out. So the next steps are reviewing, identifying and teaching your school expectations, right? This is sort of that big core step one. You want to keep your expectations or values easy to remember. Hopefully you have 3 to 5 of them. Sometimes we call them core values. Sometimes you'll hear expectations. They're both the same thing. If you haven't already created them, seek input from those key stakeholders, students, families, and staff. Hopefully you already did create them. You may need to run them by your staff again if they haven't fully incorporated into your school's culture yet. Once you have those values identified, you're going to teach how they look throughout the building to everybody, right? So a behavioral matrix is what we commonly use to organize those behaviors based on each value, like safe, respectful, responsible, and what those look like throughout your building. In different locations like hallway, classroom, on the bus, and different routines, coming to school, transitions, right, exiting school. Your matrix can then be used to develop explicit lesson plans. They don't have to really be long, but you want them to be clear for teachers to use so they can teach students how that behavior should look and sound like within these different contexts of your buildings, like the classroom, hallway, the gym, and so on. You want to keep your teaching and reteaching organized, right? So you want to have physical lesson plans on paper, as well as maybe a calendar for the year about when you're going to teach different things. Like when you're going to do your boosters teaching and when you're going to do your initial teaching, things like that. There's a couple of extra videos here that you might want to review. And again, if you think you need to look at your matrix and make changes for next year, possibly safety protocols or some things around distance learning, do take the time to update your matrices. And then your class-wide expectations, we're going to review that a little deeper next month, so we'll get into that then. The next few steps focus on developing a continuum of responses to both desired behaviors and undesired behaviors, right? So first, we always want to focus on the positive, right? The acknowledgement systems to encourage the behavior we do want to see. Remember, you always get more of the behavior you pay attention to. So systems like a ticket system or gotchas or dojos, maybe marble jars or stamps, anything like that. It should be really efficient for teachers to provide to students and predictable to the students that they know they're going to get them on a regular basis. You want to ensure that your acknowledgement systems and what they're earning are desirable by your students. And there should be some things that they get and also opportunities to escape things, maybe escape a homework assignment, to take a break, right? Maybe to escape the lunchroom and have a quiet lunch somewhere else. So think about different things. And it needs to be feasible for the staff to do it. And as always, you want to gain input from your staff and students and families about the different reinforcers you're offering. And don't forget the adults in the building. They're learning new skills as well. So we want to reinforce them. And it should apply to all of the adults in your building, not just the teachers. Don't forget your secretaries and maintenance staff and everybody else as well. Okay, so despite our best efforts to be proactive and positive, some students will still exhibit behavior that is inappropriate, right? Some behavioral errors. So we have to have a continuum of responses to address those errors. We want to reduce disparities in discipline. So having definitions for every behavior really helps us to do that. It takes away the subjectivity of it. There's one definition for those behaviors that we all agree on. And we want to review that with our staff, go over it with them, give them time to review that. Hopefully you've also created a flow chart or a behavioral level system that helps staff know how to react, when to react, which behaviors should be managed in the classroom by staff and teachers, and which behaviors need to be managed in the office by the administration. Right, so clearly delineating those and making a flow chart on how to respond. How do I respond the first time? What if it keeps going? And how do I document that, right? Whether it's a minor class managed behavior or a major administrative managed behavior. Right, and that brings us to the documentation. Do you have a clear referral form? Are you using an online system, right? We call that form office discipline referral. You might hear ODRs. And your flow chart, again, should reference when the staff should complete their office referral and how and who to give it to and what to do with it. So again, if your team needs to address your acknowledgement system or your discipline system, you can either do that now, but at the very least, add them to your action plan. And again, there's always supporting documentation and videos on each of these slides. All right, the final steps here are focused on your systems, especially around how to collect data for decision-making, establish systems to support your staff in using PBIS, right? Because if they're not doing it, it's not happening. And then to develop routines to ensure the staying power of PBIS. You don't want it to start to fade. Your team should develop clear routines for collecting and reviewing data on a regular basis. not once or twice a year, right? You'll need to clearly identify what target behaviors or outcomes you're seeking, right? It's going to be different, and over different years it'll change, right? You might want to work on increasing attendance or increasing engagement of students in class, or sometimes you might be looking to decrease inappropriate behavior or reduce disparities in your discipline data. And don't forget, just fidelity to PBIS or MTSS structures. Are we doing it the way we're supposed to? It's all good data. So depending on what you're focusing on, then that will determine where the data is going to come from. Okay. So with regards to supporting your staff, your team will want to think about how you're incorporating staff voice and choice into your practices and your systems, how they are being trained in PBIS. Are they getting some technical assistance or coaching if they struggle? And, you know, when do they get to see the fidelity or the outcome data that shows that their efforts matter? That's one thing that we know really ensures sustainability. We show staff, here's the data that shows there's a problem. We ask them to do certain things with students, change some systems, do some new practices. And then we want to come back and show them the data. Has it changed? Did our discipline data go down? Did our attendance go up? Right? So that they know, okay, it matters. What I'm doing actually made a difference. When we don't show them that, they'll slowly stop doing it because no one's let them know it made any difference. That's really key. Okay, so finally, your team will want to develop a plan and routines for sustaining PBIS as a whole. So this could include identifying how you'll continue to increase staff capacity. So that's those trainings, professional development, feedback. See if you can get on your district's calendar for professional development. If there's a whole day being planned, see if you can have an hour back at your school. Things like that. Internally to your school, can you get on those calendars? Are you going to present things during staff meetings? What about the people who don't come to staff meetings? Thinking about all of that. How are we going to make sure everybody is trained? And then a system for sort of formally documenting what's going on. A lot of people call these a PBIS handbook, and they're really great. You can keep updating them yearly, handing them out either paper or electronically to staff, to families, so everybody knows what's going on. And of course, that calendar of events. So if your team needs to address any of these issues, again, take note in your action plan and consider watching any of these videos or looking at these supporting documents here. So as I mentioned earlier, all of the videos on those 10 getting started step slides and we call them mini modules, they all can be found on the NEPBIS website. You go to the Tier 1 school-wide tab at the top, and we scroll down to almost to the bottom, and it says PBIS Academy Virtual Training. And when we go to that site, you will see all the different mini modules. These are all short videos under about 13 minutes, and then the slide decks that accompany them if you want those. So either now or when you're with your team, review your action plan, step back. Do we need to update anything, change anything? Going through all those first 10 getting started steps and think about what still needs to be addressed and add it to your action plan or begin working on them. So thank you for taking time today to watch this video. We talked about implicit bias. We talked about neutralizing routines for those vulnerable decision points and how that all can affect our disciplinary decisions and our data, right, when we're under pressure. We also reviewed the Tier 1 getting started steps, and then the tasks, hopefully you've completed or you're going to go complete now, are to identify potential vulnerable decision points in your building, in your school day, and develop neutralizing routines for them. And again, go back and assess that Tier 1 action plan for those getting started steps, because that's your foundation. Without those in place, it's really hard to build from there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care. done?